Our speaker today is Eric Steinle. He is the Vice President of Project Development for Rye Development. He's responsible for the development of hydro electricity production facilities. He has over 20 years of experience in developing such projects. He's going to talk to us today about a project in Southern Oregon and perhaps one also in Washington where water is essentially recycled and run through generators several times. He's married, lives in Portland, has two children who are very active, but he found time to come with us today, and we much appreciate that. Eric?
Thank you. It's excellent to be here today to talk about a couple of projects, and especially to be here to talk to Rotary in my own neighborhood. My family and I live just over by Laurelhurst Park, so I'm often out speaking across the United States or various projects. So it's very nice to be here today.
Okay, I'll go ahead and load it up here.
So as mentioned, my name is Eric Steinle, and I work for a company called Rye Development. We're considered the largest developer of low impact certifiable hydropower in the United States. And there's two types of projects that we develop here in the US. One will come as a bit of a surprise to us in the Pacific Northwest, is that we add hydropower turbines to existing dams. Believe it or not, only 3% of the dams we have in the United States have hydropower facilities. Seems pretty low, doesn't it, as an Oregonian? But it is true. So a lot of our projects, we're adding new turbines to existing navigation lock-in dams, flood control facilities, irrigation dams, and we have a lot of those projects in the Mid-Atlantic, the Midwest, New England, and the southern portion of the United States. I'm also personally responsible for a similar project. It's the last major hydro project that was constructed here in Oregon. It was a retrofit of Rooney Dam, which is just south of the community of Eugene. And we went ahead and added turbines to that just about a decade ago. And it's been generating power for local residents there in southern Lane County for about 7 years now. So today I'm going to talk to you about specifically two projects, one in Southern Oregon and one just east of us out in the gorge near the community of Goldendale, Washington, and specifically a technology called hydro pump storage, which is a type of energy storage which we think will be the cornerstone of the Pacific Northwest's clean energy economy, providing lots of new jobs during construction, but also during operation, and doing so in a way that causes very minimal environmental impacts. So I have a slide deck that I'll work through here today.
It's this direction.
Oh, it's this direction. Apologies.
It's up.
Oh, it is. Okay. Oh, one more time. So my colleague Michael Rooney was expected to be here today as I was traveling this week, but again, it's my pleasure to be here. The two projects specifically, one's called the Swan Lake Energy Storage Project. It's just outside of Klamath Falls. It's 394 megawatts in size, and I'll explain kind of how those numbers work from a market-based or needs perspective as we work through. And the second project that's out in the gorge is the Goldendale Energy Storage Project at 1,200 megawatts in size. These projects are being developed by Rye Development, the company I work for, but they are actually owned by a group called Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners, or CIP. They're one of the largest funds in the world that is specifically investing in renewable energy projects globally. In the United States, they're primarily investing in hydro pump storage, so the types of projects I'll talk about today, and then offshore wind. So many of you have probably heard of the offshore wind project off of Massachusetts, and some of the popular press, that's one of CIP's projects. So I'll talk a little bit today about this type of technology, why we're proposing it now, why it's being built. and then why energy storage is so critical for where we're heading with the electrical grid. I'll start by saying that we're probably going through the biggest change in how we use and where we get our electricity from in the past 100 years, or in sort of the whole period of time that we think about the modern electrical grid. And that's even now going to start to be more closely aligned with transportation needs, as a lot more of our vehicles, both personal vehicles and public vehicles, become electrified. I'll talk a little bit about sort of what the projects mean for the region and the amount of energy storage that's expected to be added to the system by our Pacific Northwest utilities in the next 10 years. And I'll hopefully leave a good amount of time for questions at the end. So hydro pump storage is pretty simple. I think everyone here as an Oregonian is generally aware of how hydroelectricity works. It is the oldest type of energy storage that's currently out there. The first project was built in Europe well over 100 years ago. And there's 39 pump storage projects that are currently in operation in the United States. We don't have one here in Oregon, and it'll make sense in a little bit as to why we don't. The types of projects that we're proposing are called closed loop pump storage. Essentially, we're building 2 new artificial reservoirs on the landscape. These are lined, closed facilities, and filling them essentially one time, and then moving water back and forth based on the demands of the grid. So we're not using an existing river or an existing lake or any kind of existing aquatic ecosystem for the purposes of generating and storing electricity. How the system works, these projects that we're proposing are tied into the grid or into the transmission system in locations where a whole host of regional utilities, including Portland General Electric, our local utility, have transmission access and can use or actually bring renewable electricity into their system as well. So during periods of time when there's excess wind electricity, which has been seasonally, for sure, for all the wind that we see when we drive out the gorge, and is now occurring more and more often. And then when there's too much solar power, which right now is happening every day, there's solar power available that we cannot use in our system because there's too much for the system to handle, and it's not stored, right? That energy is used to pump water from the lower reservoir into the upper reservoir itself. And then during periods of time when there is need for electricity, but the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing, that water is released and you have 100% carbon-free on-demand electricity. And just to give you a sense of scale, and I'll talk a little bit about scale as we move through this, the Goldendale project just east of us here in Portland, the largest project features are 2 60-acre ponds. And the rest of the project features are subsurface, which is pretty typical for these types of facilities. We haven't built one of these projects in the US in 30 years, but they've been building a lot of these projects in Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, and they're all tied to places where they've been adding a lot of wind and solar into the grid. So for the project out in the gorge, the Goldendale project, if that project is realized, we would have 1,200 megawatts of on-demand renewable electricity for 12 hours. So that's enough to provide 100% of the electricity needs for every house in Seattle. And the landscape impact is just 2 60-acre ponds. So it's an incredible resource for the Pacific Northwest. And is enviable, especially when we're in communities in other portions of the US, which will have an extremely large uphill battle when they're approaching how to take coal out of their system and actually decarbonize their system. We're also fortunate in the Pacific Northwest in that well over half of our current electricity already is renewable. It comes from our legacy hydro, and it also allows us to have some of the cheapest electricity that's not only carbon-free, but some of the cheapest electricity in the world. So why are we proposing these projects now? What is the point of these storage projects? In some cases, the project both in Southern Oregon and a similar project on the gorge have been looked at since the 1970s. It's not a new technology, it's not a new idea, so why now? The main reason is that popular demand and associated policy now up and down the West Coast are compelling us to decarbonize our electrical grid. And so we could spend the whole afternoon talking about that and sort of the changes that have occurred just over the last 20 years. But up there on the slide, you see basically the result of this demand and the associated legislation, and most importantly, the timeline by which we're proposing in each of these states to be 100% carbon free. When you first start building wind and solar in your system, so for those that traveled out in the gorge 10, 15 years ago, and the excitement around Vestas and Iberdrola and others coming to Portland and setting up shop under the business energy tax credit and other projects then, those projects were pretty easy to incorporate into the grid. We had a lot of existing hydropower, and we were adding natural gas into the system. So for an intermittent source of electricity like solar and wind, you need to have a source of electricity generation that's 24/7, that's on demand. And we have two primary sources for that: hydropower, natural gas generation, and to a lesser extent, coal that could be used for that. When you start adding a lot of wind and solar into the system, which is what we've been doing over the last 20 years or so, you get to a point where you're going to need to add additional storage if you're not going to be able to rely on fossil fuels. The other way you can go about this would be to build a lot of new traditional hydropower, which, based on environmental constraints and a lot of other factors, we're not in an environment anymore where large hydropower of the traditional sense is a palatable option in moving forward. So that leads us to the storage discussion. And we first became interested in developing this type of hydropower and these types of storage projects just about 7 years ago or so, 7, 8 years ago, when our utilities here in the Pacific Northwest first started taking a look as part of their normal planning processes called the Integrated Resource Planning process. Every utility is required to do it every 2 years, at what would happen post 2020 if legislation passed compelling states or regions to move towards a near 100% renewable electricity goal, and how much storage they would need to add into the system.
Oh, you know what?
It went to sleep.
No, it's my fault.
I can keep talking. So right now in the Pacific Northwest, it is viewed, and it is viewed that just based on the goals for renewables and the demands for electricity resources, that Oregon and Washington will need somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 megawatts of energy storage added to the system, starting in 2025 and concluding in the 2035 to 2040 time horizon. Now that's quite a range, right? Why do I put some range in there? Well, those numbers also don't account for any electric vehicles in the system. And so California, just in the past month or so, is starting to look at the actual storage needs and generation needs with full electric vehicles penetrating the system starting in the 2026 to 2030 timeline. And the amount of storage that they're forecasting now is triple what it was a year ago. And so those numbers are a little bit dated, but it gives you a sense of, for these scale of projects, we're talking about around 1,500 megawatts of storage that these two projects could provide in the system. So it doesn't, it certainly isn't, these certainly aren't the only projects that are going to be realized here in the Pacific Northwest to meet these storage or capacity deficits, but they will play a large portion in what we need here. So I talked a little bit about scale and land use. One of the real benefits of this type of project is that it is closed loop. It has a relatively small footprint on the landscape for the amount of storage that it can provide to the system, especially when you're comparing it to sources like lithium-ion batteries, which take up vast amounts of land when they're in use to support the grid, and also require a pretty large mining and foreign supply chain. So I'll touch just a little bit on the projects and skip through the slide so we could get into some questions. The first project, and This is the most mature, is the Swan Lake Energy Storage Project. It's just less than 400 megawatts in size and will provide 9 hours of storage. It connects into the Malin substation, again, just about 11 miles northeast of the community of Klamath Falls. This project is fully permitted, and it's going through its final design stages to begin construction. We hope to have full notice to proceed with construction from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission about 12 months from now. Once we begin that process, it's a 4-year construction project. 1,500 to 2,000 new jobs will be created in Klamath Falls, and a large new tax base associated with the project as well. I've got a map here to take a look at where it is exactly. It's a little bit crude. But here, the main components that you see on this slide, you see the 2 blue dots there to the left. Those are the new artificial reservoirs that we're constructing. And then you have a penstock or a pipe that connects the two reservoirs. In this case, in Southern Oregon, it's a surface penstock. It's not below the surface, and then a powerhouse near the lower reservoir. The areas you see delineated in kind of a brownish taupe color, those are our construction staging areas. Pretty massive civil project. Yeah.
What's the elevation change between the 2 reservoirs?
Yeah, good question. So Swan Lake is 1,500 vertical feet. At the Goldendale project, it's well over 2,000 vertical feet between the 2 reservoirs.
Are those open ponds? And how do you deal with the evaporation?
Yeah, great question. So they're both open ponds, and to kind of give you a sense of water use, the project in Klamath Falls went actually through a nearly decade-long permitting process. And part of that was to get the Department of Oregon Water Resources to endorse the use of existing groundwater wells in a way that could be determined sustainable over a 100-year period of time. One of the benefits of these types of projects is that, unlike batteries where you have to throw them out every 15 years and ratepayers like us are on the hook for replacing those, these are like our legacy hydro. Once you build it, it operates at a relatively low cost for 100 to 200 years, right? So we needed a sustainable fuel source, which in this case is water, to operate the system in a similar manner. So this is a distinct and separate aquifer in this area from the Klamath aquifer that you probably read about in the Oregonian and some of the other water use issues in Klamath that are a challenge. And it's essentially one family that owns all of it. And so we did a series of studies to ensure that we could pump water one time into the system and then offset evaporation. So talking about water use, this project, it's a one-time fill of the system of around 4,000 to 5,000 acre feet of water into the system. And then we're going to use about 300 acre feet of water per year to offset evaporation, basically. For the Goldendale project, a little bit bigger, I think it's a 9,000 acre foot initial fill of the system, and about 400 acre feet of water per year will be needed to offset evaporation in those locations. It'll actually be slightly less at Goldendale because we're proposing to use a device. They're actually called shade balls, and they cover the reservoirs. They're used by the aviation industry a lot near airports so that birds aren't attracted to ponds. In this location, the Goldendale project is flanked by existing wind projects, so they don't want our reservoirs to attract birds, but it also helps offset some of the evaporative losses.
When they are open ponds, is there an opportunity for recreation or other uses of it?
Good question. There isn't. So unlike our traditional hydro where you can have multi-use purposes here, one of the advantages of this is that it can go from pump to generation mode multiple times a day, depending on the needs of the grid. If it's windy or there's no wind, or we go immediately.
So the water levels move a lot.
Yeah, water fluctuation can be extremely dramatic in the reservoirs, so they're not safe for recreation. This is a project timeline for Swan Lake. As I mentioned, we're hoping to begin construction just about 12 months from now. And it's approximately a 3.5 to 4 year construction process to bring the project online.
So you have 9 hours of drain time, then how long does it take to fill back up? I mean, it depends on all kinds of stuff, but
Yeah.
what's the projection on that?
Yeah, so it's roughly, if you drained it all the way to the lower pool, it would take you roughly about 2.5 hours longer to pump it up than you can actually get out of generation from the project. And it's unlikely for both projects that they'll be used for that whole duration of time all the time. That there'll be a bit of generation and storage each day. Seasonally, there will be times like at Goldendale where we're relying on a 12-hour storage product a lot of the time. But it'll probably be moving back and forth a little bit more. So we won't go from, full, full generation to pump all the way through the system.
Is that automatic or is somebody actually personally making those decisions?
Good question. This works just like a normal hydro type powerhouse. There's multiple operators in the powerhouse on site that are making adjustments on the project. That said, there's a lot of automation. If you've gone and toured one of the hydro facilities out on the Columbia, which I would encourage everyone to do if you haven't, it's pretty amazing. They look quite different today. There's a lot of automation. They could be operated remotely, but because these are Federal Energy Regulatory Commission regulated projects, we do have to have on-site operations for the facilities. Yeah.
You mentioned getting permission to access ground well water. Does
Yes.
that create any political issues for you with farmers, ranchers who are fearful of the loss of that water?
That's a great question. So this type of project, because it's a hydro resource, undergoes an extremely thorough permitting process that takes years to complete. The only process that is longer and more thorough would be if we were trying to propose a new nuclear facility. So if you want to build a wind or solar project, you don't have to go through any federal permitting process. You could flank this whole area with solar and have it up in 6 months. And to build 2 60-acre ponds here takes at least 5 years. And in the case of the Southern Oregon project, almost a decade to permit. And the level of public scrutiny is the bar is high, right? So we had public meetings for a series of years in Southern Oregon and also out here in the gorge to get through a list of studies that were suggested by our state and federal resource agencies, the tribes, members of the public. And one of the most important studies recommended early on by the community was what's going to happen to our groundwater. And we think this is going to impact our wells down valley. And part of our approach here was to study the aquifer system well ahead of doing anything and propose something that we felt the Water Resources Department could endorse from a sustainability standpoint. So to speed up my story here, we did a bunch of well pump testing that was overseen by Water Resources. And we had a lot of volunteers down valley that thought when they pump these wells like this, we're going to see incredible amounts of change in our wells. And there were no changes determined at all in any of the wells down valley when we did the pump tests to support the application. One of the primary reasons is that these wells are already there. These are existing groundwater wells. We just did a transfer. So some of it was permanent, some of it was temporary, where we're transferring the use of those wells for ag. So some of the ag is coming out of production during the one-time fill of the system. And then there's a permanent amount of ag that was retired associated with the water that we need to offset evaporation. So we're not pumping the wells at any different rate than was historically used. We're just using that water for a different purpose. So really the only trade-off you would see is that when you're using this groundwater for ag, there is surface water runoff and you're applying it to the ground, right? We're essentially using that water to fill this closed system. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? Yeah.
What's the minimum elevation difference that you need to make something like this efficient? I'm wondering if this works in states like Florida or Kansas or.
Yeah, great question. So those are states that have a much more expensive and much more difficult route to decarbonization and large amounts of renewables, if that's going to be part of their mission. These types of projects wouldn't work there. The lowest head pump storage project of scale that I'm aware of in the US is the Ludington Pump Storage Project on Lake Michigan. It's worth Googling it and looking at it. It's quite fascinating. The lower reservoir is Lake Michigan. It's an open loop project. And then just 200 vertical feet above the lake, there's a bluff with a large circular shaped upper reservoir. So that's the lowest amount that I'm aware of, and it certainly works there. Most of the historic pump storage in the US was built to pair with a nuclear facility. Nuclear facilities are really expensive to ramp up and ramp down based on our electricity demands throughout the day. But as you can imagine, we use a lot less electricity at night when we're all sleeping than we do at certain times of the day. And so when they have that excess electricity coming from the nuclear facility, they would just use that to pump water uphill and then, you know, drop it as needs peaked other times of the day. All those projects now in the US are being retooled to actually integrate wind and solar.
What's the net efficiency? Because I assume it takes more energy to push it up.
Yeah.
Than you get coming down.
Exactly, yeah. You can't beat the loss of So all batteries, as you're suggesting, have an efficiency rating. Pump storage is around 80% efficient, 76 to 80% efficient. Both our projects are around 79% efficient. And so other battery technologies you've heard of, like flywheels or lithium ion batteries, flow batteries, they have a range in efficiency as low as around 45% efficient up to around, there's some that are in the high 80s at this point. So pump storage is looked at as, you know, the most cost-effective, most tried and true, and most efficient of those technologies that are already available. I'm certain that there's someone at MIT right now or Caltech working on a battery with a higher level of efficiency to learn about.
1,500 minimum ongoing jobs after it's open.
No, 1,500 jobs at Swan Lake during construction. That's a conservative
That
estimate.
was my question.
Yeah.
Construction, but what's the permanent?
So for Swan Lake, we're estimating that, oh, I'm pointing the wrong way again. That's my bad.
Go ahead.
Looking at the screen.
No, go ahead.
See that. I'll leave this up for now. These sites. Swan Lake, we're estimating about a dozen permanent jobs at the facility itself. For Goldendale, it would be nearly double that. There's more complexity in how the powerhouse is constructed and operated at Goldendale. But we hired Eco Northwest, an economic consulting firm here in Portland, to do an assessment of job creation during construction and during operation. There's also a 3+ multiplier during the operational phase on the projects that, you know, expands primarily to the closest community, which for Goldendale would be the community of Goldendale and then the Dalles, and at Klamath, excuse me, and for Klamath County, it is the community of Klamath Falls. So those are a mix of jobs, right? I mean, they're a mix of, you know, people that are service technicians, you know, working as electrical contractors, other things to the project, but they're also service sector jobs and other things related to those new jobs in the community. But those jobs, by the way, so there's a couple things to think from a jobs perspective. One, that both these projects will be union built projects. We've signed MOUs with the building trades in both Washington and in Oregon. Attrition is real with the building trades. And so having a project in one location for 4 years is really exciting to the building trades because they can get apprentices there. They can come with their families, be in one location for 4 years and be a journeyman when they're done. And, you know, 2 generations ago, those types of projects were everywhere, or much more common, at least I'm told, by the building trades. They're not now. And so, you know, these are good opportunities. Yes, go ahead.
Given the ongoing drought in the West and the likely impacts of climate change, is there an opportunity to use a medium other than water to accomplish the same thing?
Great question. For this type of technology, it's been done with brackish water. It's also been done with salt water. So Japan has a saltwater facility. So yes, you could use something else besides, you know, potable or surface water. The Goldendale project's water comes from Klickitat County Public Utility District. We essentially have a tap we turn on and they sell us the water to fill it one time, and then we offset evaporation. And so from a commercial customer in Klickitat County, their previous commercial customer, and this is the site where the lower reservoir is in Klickitat County, the former customer was an aluminum smelter, which has now been shut for almost 2 decades. That customer used 8,000 acre feet of water per year from the utility district and had about 30 permanent jobs. Those are the best jobs in the community of Goldendale. They've been gone for nearly 2 decades. So we're coming back, providing the same amount of permanent jobs for that community. And we're using about 300 acre feet of water per year from the utility. So from, county planning, economic development perspective, incredibly wise use of water for the economic impact it has. Yeah, I don't know who's first. Go ahead.
I mean, the project makes the. Okay. Right online. The project makes a lot of sense. Then there are a number of environmental groups that are against it. I know Columbia Riverkeeper is and the Sierra Club. So what's their argument against it?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So the argument against it isn't your classic environmental argument, right? That this impacts birds or waters or, other things like that. It has none of those impacts. I mean, we're building 2 artificial ponds on a landscape and a tap that turns on from the public utility district. They have sided at this point with the Yakima Nation, who is opposed to the development of this project. And we started this process, like any of RISE projects, by meeting with everyone in the local community, including the Yakima Nation, to understand what their opinions were of development in this portion of the county. This project in Klickitat County, the Goldendale Energy Storage Project, while we're the developer of it, it's really the vision of the county and the community of Goldendale. They have been pushing on this project for almost 2 decades, and it's the centerpiece of what they call the Klickitat County Energy Overlay Zone. So there's a reason why when you drive out, you see no wind turbines, and then you see a massive amount of them in Klickitat County. And those are in the energy overlay zone. There's also a lot of solar there, right? And the county set out to make, that their primary new source of economic development, because the main transmission system that runs from Canada all the way to Mexico runs right through their county. And so looking around, what are the resources we have? We don't have, Interstate 84s in the other county. We don't have some of these other things, but we do have access to the transmission that connects Washington with California and with Oregon. At this point in time, there are interests, and they're not just tribal interests, right? That think that we have enough renewable energy development, that it's an eyesore on the landscape, that it's impacting the landscape from a perspective that, was not well thought through. In this case, only dating back 15 years, right? They're not happy with the way that the wind turbines look, and the way that, they've taken up space on the landscape, regardless if they're providing carbon-free electricity and, helping us combat climate change. They're just not interested in that kind of development, period. And that's where we find ourselves with this project. I mean, it sits entirely on private land, one landowner. All the project facilities, access roads, everything else have been built to the project. So from an impact standpoint, I've never been to a project where there was so little greenfield development needed to actually, realize the project. It's also the only project that we've developed where we've had a standing ovation from the local community as we shepherded it forward and had full support all the way up to the governor's office. But that said, there are certainly people that are uninterested in seeing additional energy development of any kind, wind, solar, pump storage, in this portion of the state. For the project in Southern Oregon, we don't have environmental opposition, so including support from the tribe. So, yeah.
You've got different projects in different sites with different topography. I'm just wondering how it affects it. 200 feet at a bluff in Lake Michigan and 1,500 or 2,000 feet here. The drop the diameter of the pipe, the
Yeah.
angle of the pipe. All that would seem to change the speed of the water in the pipe, or even the size of the pipe.
Exactly. So those are good questions. We could spend a lot of time talking about that, but at a basic level, right? We are not, we're a private developer, right? We're not a utility. And so these projects have to make sense in the marketplace. We have to be able to compete with lithium ion batteries, other types of storage, other types of renewables plus storage. So for us, we wouldn't look at a project like Ludington and think that it works. Those projects were proposed at a time where you had one type of utility that controlled everything, proposing projects, and they were certain that Detroit was going to make cars for the next 200 years, right? And so it doesn't really matter. Those efficiencies and cost in marketplace, they matter, but they don't matter as much. For us, they matter much more, right? This has to make sense in front of our utility commissioners, right? As a project that's the best value for ratepayers, or we can't enter into the long-term contracts with our public utilities to use a portion of this project. And for each of these projects, we'll have multiple utilities participating in it. Where they enter the grid, there are many utilities that have access to those substations that can utilize this storage project. So for us, minimum head is probably around 400 feet in elevation. And what that allows us to do is to size a project that in general, and it scales up, right? The 1200 megawatt project is pretty big. The 400 megawatt project is fairly small. But the 400 megawatt project and how it's sized costs similarly to a gas-fired power plant. And that's done on purpose because that's the only type of new generation of any real size that we've been building, approving, and has been reviewed and looked at from a rate-based standpoint as something that's palatable to ratepayers across the United States over the last 20 years. So a lot of people have asked us, why are you building these projects so small when the demand is so great? And that's because the Swan Lake project will be the first project constructed in 30 years. So it better look and feel a lot like an energy project that we've approved and works in our rate system. Does that answer your question?
What's the
Different.
Okay.
Not exactly. It was more of, is it such that the turbines, we want a certain velocity, and so we adjust our plumbing to get that, whether it's by height or angle or diameter?
Oh, I see your question. Yeah, so the pump turbines that are for the projects, they can accommodate a project of real, small scale. You could build a pump storage project with just the right size pump turbine and the right size penstock in one of our water storage towers, here in Portland, right, of small scale. But would that be competitive with the lithium ion battery in your garage? Probably not, right? It would cost, there would be more parts to it and a cost to it that wouldn't make it as comparable. Could you do it? Certainly, all the technology's there. And then you size up from there, right? I mean, you're gonna have different size turbines, different size penstocks, or the tunnels that connect the two reservoirs, different size powerhouses, depending on the size of the project.
But what's the difference between what's your cost per kilowatt hour and what can you sell it for?
Two good questions. So the projects are the way that they're sized are just less than $2,000 per kW. And we're not selling them like a typical type of electricity. This is a storage project. So how it works is we essentially enter into a tolling type agreement where a utility can utilize a certain amount of the project from a capacity standpoint. And so they're paying for the ability to take their solar and take their wind and store it there for a while and then bring that back as on-demand renewable electricity, right? So it's a tolling type product. And the amount that we're charging, much like a hotel, right? You don't own it, but you pay a fee, you go and use it when you're on vacation and you leave. So that's the type of contractual relationship that we have with utilities for the storage there. It's similar to a gas type, natural gas type tolling.
Eric, we have a question from Pam at the top of our screen.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Did I misunderstand? I thought you said this was one landowner that owns all the land where the construction is taking place. Is that a private citizen or is this a city or county owned property?
Yeah, so we're talking about two projects. The project that is east of us here in the gorge, it is just one single landowner. He lives here in Portland, that owns 100% of all the land associated with the project.
And what are his rights then?
What are his private property
Rights, what are his rights?
What are his rights in consideration that your building is on his land? Is he donating the land to a public utility district or?
No, we have entered into a lease arrangement with this landowner,
Okay,
a long-term lease to lease the property for construction and operation. And he's currently redeveloping other portions of the property for other commercial development. He has not owned the property for that long, but he's owned it, I think, for close to a couple of decades at this point. Purchased it after the aluminum smelter closed and is redeveloping it into other commercial ventures. Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I probably don't have time to click through the slides, but the Swan Lake and Goldendale projects have their own individual websites. If you just Google them, you can get to them. There's newsletters that come out every quarter for those. And especially if you're interested in following along, we're still in the permitting process for Goldendale. The draft EIS comment period just closed for the state of Washington, but the EIS process for the federal process is throughout 2023. So we make it pretty easy to click on and participate, and would encourage all of you to at least sign up for the newsletter if you're interested in hearing more about how the project gets permitted and construction. Cool. So I appreciate the opportunity today.
Thank you, Eric, very much. Thank you.